Some treasures aren't made of gold. Some are wrapped in scent, of old cedar, of lavender hands, of goodbyes never said. Apollo didn't understand death, but he knew absence. He knew that the voices were gone and the hands that once held him didn't return. So he held on to what they left behind, even if no one else saw its worth. Chapter 1. The Dog in the Park. Morning cracked slowly over the city. Light spilled between thinning clouds, brushing rooftops in fading silver. Down below, tucked near the edge of the old park, a golden retriever sat beneath a knotted oak. He didn't move. Not much. Only his tail gave the occasional slow sweep, brushing back grass still jeweled with dew. Between his front paws rested a wooden box, aged, scuffed, and small enough to carry but heavy with something unspoken. He licked it once, gently, then nudged it forward a few inches, nose pressed to the lid like he was listening. A jogger passed by, headphones in, casting only a curious glance. The dog, Apollo, didn't look up. He had brought the box here again. Just like yesterday. Just like every day for nearly a year. To the same tree, the same patch of earth. Sometimes he buried it. Sometimes he lay beside it. Sometimes he just sat and stared, as if waiting for something only he believed would return. Across the street, on the porch of a modest, vine-draped home, an aging man stood with a steaming mug of coffee. John squinted toward the park, then turned slightly as his wife stepped outside. "There he is again," she said softly, pulling her cardigan tighter. "Same spot." John nodded, but said nothing. He had seen the dog before, many times, but always from afar. Always near that tree. Always guarding that odd little box like it was sacred. "He's not just stray," Margaret added. "He belongs to someone." John took a sip, letting the silence stretch between them. "No collar," he muttered. "No leash, but always the box." As if summoned, Apollo raised his head. His eyes, deep and honey-rich, met theirs across the park. Not a bark, not a whimper, just a look. A long, hollow look. The kind that makes you forget for a moment that dogs aren't supposed to carry grief. Chapter 2. John and Margaret. The sun lifted lazily above the rooftops, spreading gold across the cracked sidewalks like memory spilled from a glass. Margaret stood at the window, tea in hand, her eyes tracing the outline of the golden dog beneath the oak. "He hasn't left that tree," she murmured, mostly to herself. John, hunched over his chair at the breakfast table, gave a quiet grunt that could have meant agreement or disinterest. His reading glasses sat low on his nose, and the newspaper, untouched, lay folded before him like it was more habit than necessity. "He's not chasing cars, doesn't bark, just sits there," Margaret continued. John looked up. "Plenty of dogs hang around the park?" "Not like this one." Margaret's voice had softened in a way that made John pause. She turned to him slowly. "I think he's waiting for someone." John exhaled, long and tired. Or something. Their house was the kind people passed without noticing. A middle-aged cottage in a middle-aged neighborhood, built with sensible bricks and quiet routines. The garden out front had faded roses and one persistent hummingbird feeder Margaret refused to take down. Inside, the rooms were neat, but quiet. Far too quiet for two people who had once raised children within its walls. Their youngest had moved to Colorado 2 years ago. The elder one hadn't called since spring. They weren't exactly grieving, but they weren't entirely whole either. Just two lives drifting gently through days, like leaves following the stream's rhythm. Maybe that's why Margaret noticed the golden retriever more than John did. Maybe that's why, that afternoon, when the sky turned a little grayer and the wind pressed colder against the windows, she took a small container of leftover roast chicken, wrapped it in foil, and walked across the street. John watched from the porch, his thumb circling the rim of his coffee cup. He didn't stop her. Margaret approached slowly, her shoes crunching over scattered acorns. Apollo raised his head as she neared, but made no move to run. His ears twitched, eyes calm and glassy. "Hi there, sweetheart," she said softly, crouching a few feet away. "You hungry?" She unwrapped the foil and set the chicken pieces down in front of her, then leaned back, palms open on her knees. Apollo stared, not at the food, at her, as if measuring something deeper than kindness. Then, after a long moment, he stood and stepped forward. His movements were fluid, slow, like water pouring itself into a shape. He nudged the chicken once before beginning to eat, careful, quiet, never looking away from the woman's eyes for long. Margaret smiled. She noticed then the box. It was behind him, nestled against the roots of the oak, partially covered by leaves he'd pushed over it. Old wood, faded floral carvings, a lock but no keyhole. It looked handmade, not expensive, but loved. "A treasure box?" she whispered. Apollo's head rose sharply at that. He moved between her and the box, not aggressively, but firmly, a line drawn. Margaret nodded. "Okay, I understand." She sat with him for a little longer, watching the wind tug at the trees. When she returned home, she was quiet. John raised an eyebrow. "Well?" he asked. "He has a name," she said, pulling off her shoes. "Apollo." "You saw a tag?" She shook her head. "No tag, but he knows it. I just knew." That night, rain came quietly, a drizzle like whispered apologies. John and Margaret lay in their separate sides of the bed, listening to it patter on the roof like footsteps overhead. "I think he's been hurt," she said finally. John rolled onto his side. "He doesn't look injured." "No, I mean, inside." A pause. "We could bring him in," she added. John sighed. "We don't need a dog, Maggie." "No," she agreed, "but I think he needs us." Outside, under the oak tree, Apollo curled around his box as the rain fell. His eyes remained open, watching something invisible in the dark. Something only he could see. Something that hadn't come back yet, but might. Chapter 3. The Rescue. The storm came fast and without ceremony. No thunder, just wind that snapped at windows and rain that came sideways, sweeping in sheets over the park's worn grass. Trees bent like old backs, groaning under the pressure. A trash can rolled down the street like a metal tumbleweed, its contents scattered in the downpour. Margaret stood at the living room window, arms folded tightly across her chest. "He's still out there," she whispered, eyes locked on the black blur beneath the oak tree. John joined her, rubbing the back of his neck. "Damn fool of a dog." "He won't leave it," she said. The box. Of course, it was the box. Apollo had wedged it under the thickest roots of the tree that morning, then sat beside it as the skies darkened. Now the dirt around it was turning to mud, washing out in little rivers. Still, the dog didn't move. Margaret turned abruptly. "I'm going." John caught her arm. "Maggie, he's not our responsibility." "No," she said sharply. "He's someone's." Before he could argue, she'd slipped on her coat and was already out the door, umbrella snapping in the wind. By the time she reached the tree, her boots were soaked through. Apollo stood up as she approached, body low, tail still. He looked more like a statue than a dog, rain dripping from his fur in sad rivulets, his body guarding the box like a soldier left behind. "Oh, you poor, stubborn boy," Margaret murmured, crouching beside him. He didn't growl, didn't move, just stared at her with eyes full of something ancient. She laid a hand on his wet neck. "You can't stay here. Come on, let's go home." Apollo turned to the box, then back at her. "You can bring it," she offered gently. "Bring it with you." That's when he moved. He bent, took the box into his mouth by the handle like a briefcase, and followed her. John opened the front door just as they reached the porch. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "You brought him in." "I didn't," Margaret said, stepping aside. "He chose." Apollo crossed the threshold like he'd done it before. Paws quiet on the hardwood, head held low, but not frightened. He paused at the fireplace and laid the box down on the rug, water pooling around it. John stood with arms crossed, watching as the dog circled the box once, then sat beside it, chest puffed like a sentry. Margaret fetched a towel, knelt beside him, and began to dry him gently. Apollo allowed it, only flinching once when she grazed a scar behind his ear. An old wound, healed, but not forgotten. "That's a good boy," she whispered, pressing her forehead briefly to his. Later that night, while Margaret made soup and the fireplace crackled, John sat in his worn leather chair and stared across the room at Apollo, who lay curled beside the box as if he were part of it. "He's too quiet," John said. Margaret stirred the pot. "He's grieving." John shook his head. "Dogs don't grieve like us." "Maybe not," she said softly, "but they remember." John glanced again at the box, at the claw marks on its surface, at the way the dog rested a paw against it, even in sleep. "What could be in there?" he asked aloud. Margaret didn't answer. Neither did Apollo. But the fire cracked louder at that moment, a sudden, hollow pop. And for just a second, John felt like the room had exhaled something it had been holding for too long. Outside, the storm eased, but inside, something had shifted. A new presence lived with them now. Quiet, watchful, made of fur and sorrow and something sacred, and a box that had yet to be opened. Chapter 4. The Treasured Guardian. By the second morning, Apollo had made it clear. The box stayed. No exceptions. No negotiations. John tried moving it once, only an inch or two, just to vacuum the rug. Apollo had been dozing in the corner, but the moment the box shifted, the dog snapped awake, padded silently over, and placed a paw directly on the lid. Not a growl, not a bark, just a look. The kind that made John mutter under his breath and walk away. "He's got the eyes of a soldier," John told Margaret later. "Not a house pet." Margaret smiled as she folded towels. "Maybe he's both." The box rested now beneath the living room window, nestled between an old armchair and the fireplace. Apollo lay beside it almost constantly, moving only for meals, short walks, and moments of quiet companionship. He didn't play with toys, didn't chew things, didn't even bark at squirrels through the window like a normal dog. He simply watched the door, the shadows, the way sunlight moved across the room, and always, always, the box. One afternoon, as Margaret swept, her sleeve brushed the corner of the lid. Apollo's ears perked. He sat up, alert. Margaret raised her hands. "It's okay, boy. I'm not touching it." He didn't move, but didn't relax either. Only when she stepped back did he lower himself again, curling around the wood like it was something alive, something that breathed and needed guarding. That evening, over dinner, Margaret said what they'd both been thinking. "Someone loved him fiercely," she said. "You don't protect something like that unless it matters." John poured himself another glass of wine. "Or unless you were told to." Margaret tilted her head. "I mean," he continued, "maybe that box was given to him with purpose, trained to protect it. Maybe military, therapy, something." Margaret considered that. Then why is he alone? John didn't answer, because the thought haunted him too. Later that night, after Margaret had gone to bed and the house had fallen into its soft hush, John remained by the fireplace. A low jazz record spun on the old turntable. He watched Apollo from his chair. The dog was awake, staring out the window. The box glowed faintly in the moonlight, edges softened by shadow. John set his glass down and spoke, low and unsure. "What's in there, boy?" Apollo didn't move. "I know you're not just guarding wood. You're guarding memory, something sacred, maybe even something dangerous." Still, the dog did not blink, but his tail tapped once against the floor. Not joy, not alarm, just acknowledgement. A pause. Then Apollo stood, padded to the front door, and looked back. "You want out?" He scratched once. John followed him out into the chilly air. The park was quiet, wrapped in fog like a breath being held. Apollo trotted across the road and, without hesitation, returned to the tree. The same tree. He sniffed the roots, circled twice, then began to dig. John stepped closer, heart beginning to quicken. He hadn't brought a flashlight, but the street lamp nearby offered enough glow to see what the dog unearthed. A worn scarf, a Polaroid photograph, a small metal object, twisted, burnt slightly at the edge. Apollo nudged the photo toward him. John picked it up, wiping away the dirt. The image was faded but visible. An older couple, smiling beside a younger man. A man that looked remarkably like a younger version of him. His throat tightened. What the hell is this? Apollo sat beside him, chest rising and falling, eyes fixed on the ground as if waiting for something else to surface. Not from the dirt, but from John himself. Something buried. The night held its breath. And under that gnarled tree, a golden retriever watched his new companion begin to remember something long forgotten, something that had never quite let go, just like him. Chapter 5. The Box's Secrets. The next morning came quietly, but the air in the house had changed. John sat at the kitchen table, the photograph in his hand, turning it over and over like a question he was afraid to ask aloud. Margaret noticed. She didn't speak. Not yet. She watched him instead, watched the way his brow tightened, how his fingers lingered over the image, like they recognized its worn edges. Finally, she asked, "What is it?" He looked up. His voice was lower than usual. "I think I knew them." Margaret's teacup froze halfway to her lips. "The couple in the photo. I think their names were Charles and Edith. They lived 3 houses down from us. Long time ago, before we moved to Texas for a few years. Friends? Not close. Friendly. But I remember them having a dog. I remember a golden retriever." He looked down at Apollo, who lay curled beside the fireplace again, the box resting against his side like a companion. He was just a pup then. I think this might be him. Margaret blinked. That was over. 10 years ago, maybe more. She looked toward the box. How long do golden retrievers live? 10, maybe 12 years. But he paused. Maybe he's not the first Apollo. Margaret's eyes widened. You think they named him after the first? I don't know. He stared at the box. But I think it's time we found out what he's guarding. It wasn't easy. Apollo resisted at first, standing over the box, placing his paw firmly on the lid. Not growling, not threatening, just steady, unmoving. A wall of fur and intention. Margaret knelt beside him. It's okay, she whispered. You can trust us. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder, and for a long moment, Apollo didn't react. Then, slowly, he stepped back. Just a few inches. Just enough. John opened the box. The hinges groaned, protesting the ears, and a faint scent escaped. Lavender, old wood, and something like dusted paper. Inside were items neatly arranged, untouched by time. An old scarf, hand-knitted and worn at the edges. A faded driver's license. Postcards, dozens of them, each addressed to John and Margaret Holloway, Maplewood Avenue. Margaret gasped. I don't remember these." John pulled out a bundle of letters tied with a pale blue ribbon. The ink was faded, but legible. "Dearest friends, we miss you terribly. Apollo's grown fast. You wouldn't believe how clever he is." The letters were full of affection. Mentions of summer picnics that never happened. Invitations that were never sent. All dated around the year John and Margaret had briefly moved away. And then, near the bottom of the box, was a smaller envelope. Thick, with a wax seal now cracked. No name on the outside. John opened it with care. Inside, a photo. The same couple, Charles and Edith, standing with an older man who looked disturbingly familiar. Not John, but someone close enough in appearance to give pause. Maybe a brother? On the back, written in careful pen, "If anything happens to us, Apollo will remember. He knows where to go. He knows who to find. Love endures." John leaned back, the room tilting slightly under the weight of the moment. Margaret placed a hand over his. "Why didn't we get these?" she whispered. "I don't know," he said quietly. "Maybe they were never mailed. Maybe they were waiting for us to come back." Apollo stepped forward then, gently nudging the scarf back into the box, his nose resting against the bundle of letters as if to say, "Now you know. Now remember." That evening, the box sat open on the table. John read through every letter. Margaret wept quietly at some, smiled at others. Apollo remained by their side the whole time, watching with eyes too old for his years. And somewhere in the silence between words, between memories, between the dog and the couple who had taken him in, something sacred passed between them. Something that said, "We're not just caretakers anymore. We're part of something."
Chapter 6, Past Echoes. John Holloway wasn't the kind of man who chased ghosts. He believed in roots, in soil, sweat, and sense. But as he sat at his old desk that morning, rereading the final letter from Charles and Edith, something in him shifted. The words wouldn't stop ringing. "If anything happens to us, Apollo will remember. He knows where to go. He knows who to find." They hadn't written "if we die." They hadn't said goodbye. They had warned. And Apollo, faithful, silent, scarred Apollo, had carried that warning like a soldier with a final message tucked beneath his armor. John spent most of that morning hunched over his laptop, scrolling through local archives. Margaret moved quietly around him, giving him space, but her glances were frequent and full of worry. He searched plane crashes in the past 5 years. At first, there was nothing. Too many results. Too many irrelevancies. Then, after a few more filters, it appeared. Private plane crash, elderly couple killed over Woodvale Forest. August 14, 2023, authorities confirmed the crash of a 2-passenger aircraft registered to Charles Bell and Edith Bell. The cause of the crash was ruled mechanical failure. No foul play suspected. Remains identified on site. John clicked the article. No photo. Just a short piece. Barely reported. No follow-up. Woodvale Forest was only 2 hours north, a stretch of wilderness filled with old hunting cabins, forgotten trails, and telephone lines that rarely worked. He zoomed in on the crash coordinates. Something in his gut turned cold. He'd been near there. Camped once with his brother, decades ago. His brother. Wait. He turned back to the photograph from the box. The man beside Charles and Edith. The resemblance was uncanny. Could it be? John pulled out an old photo album from the hallway closet, one of the few that hadn't been digitized. Dust clung to the edges. He flipped through it with shaking hands until he found it. His younger brother, Daniel. Leaning against a tree, crooked smile, arms slung around a teenage John. The same angular face. The same dark hair. And unmistakably the same man in the photo from the box. John sank into the couch. "Margaret," he called hoarsely. She appeared quickly, her hands already wiping on her apron. "What is it?" He showed her the two photographs. This man. With Charles and Edith. "That's my brother." She looked back and forth between them, her eyes narrowing. "But Daniel's been gone for over 25 years, John finished. Disappeared. No note. No message. Everyone thought he'd left for the West Coast. Maybe joined the army. But what if? He stopped himself. Margaret's voice lowered. "You think he was with them?" "I don't know. But why else would they have a photo with him? And why wouldn't they mention it in the letters?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "What are you thinking, John?" He stood, grabbed his coat. "I'm going to City Hall." The building hadn't changed much. Still smelled faintly of old paper and fresh coffee. John asked for an archive request and was ushered to a quiet records room in the basement. The clerk on duty, a man half his age, barely looked up as John rifled through crash reports, property transfers, and ownership logs. After an hour, he found it. A log of private airstrips in Woodvale. There it was, registered under D. Holloway. Cabin number 17, Ridge Road. Private clearance. Established 1999. His brother hadn't vanished. He'd simply gone off the grid. And Charles and Edith had known. Had visited. And maybe, had died because of it. John left City Hall with a folder clutched to his chest and thoughts thundering through his skull. He sat in the car for a long time, staring out the windshield as the afternoon sun stretched across the pavement. Back home, Apollo sat near the fireplace again, eyes lifting as John entered. He rose and approached slowly, as if sensing what had been found. John crouched, placed a hand on his golden head. "You brought me back to them," he whispered. "Now tell me why." Apollo licked his palm once, then walked to the door. He scratched at it. 3 slow scratches. "Again?" John asked. The dog looked back. Waiting. Outside, the sky was fading into late orange. The tree stood quietly across the street, the soil around it still disturbed from the last dig. But this time, Apollo didn't go there. He turned left, walking with purpose toward the deeper trail into the park, past where the lamps ended, where only old trees and silence grew. John hesitated. Then followed. And as they walked into the trees together, neither of them spoke. But both knew, the past wasn't just echoing. It was calling them back. Chapter 7, The Plane Crash. The trail was overgrown. Apollo moved ahead with certainty, brushing past brambles and ducking under drooping limbs. John followed, flashlight in hand, heart pounding louder than the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. They stopped at a clearing. Apollo pawed at the earth, revealing something buried under moss and dirt, a twisted metal plaque, half melted, its lettering barely visible. Woodvale Airstrip, private access only. John crouched. His fingers brushed cold steel. Nearby, fragments of burnt canvas, scraps of plastic, and blackened wood told a story the wind had tried to erase. This wasn't just a crash site. It was abandoned evidence. Apollo sat quietly, eyes fixed on the treetops. John's stomach turned. He took photos. Soil samples. Not because he knew what to do with them, but because something inside told him this wasn't mechanical failure. Back home, he made calls. Discreet ones. A retired mechanic from the aviation board. A friend from years ago in the sheriff's office. One response stuck with him. Charles Bell's plane had no reported mechanical issues. In fact, it was due for its next inspection the following week. But after the crash, the investigation was closed in 3 days. 3 days. A wealthy couple. A private plane. A sealed case. Too clean. John shared everything with Margaret that night. She said little, only reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Apollo lay beside the fireplace, awake, always watching. That night, John dreamed of his brother, standing beside a plane, whispering something he couldn't hear, as fire and smoke curled in the background. When he woke, Apollo was sitting beside the bed. Waiting.
Chapter 8. A Journey Begins. The road to Woodvale was narrow and cracked, flanked by trees older than memory. Apollo sat in the back seat, alert but calm. He hadn't taken his eyes off John since they left the driveway. The folder from City Hall rested on the passenger seat, with the cabin's location circled in red. Cabin number 17, Ridge Road. John hadn't been back this way in years. He had no idea his brother had ever come here at all. The cabin appeared near dusk. Tucked behind a curtain of pine and fog, it was weather-worn, but intact. Vines curled over the railings. The air smelled of wet leaves and old wood. John pushed open the creaking door. Dust danced in the golden light. The place was almost untouched, dishes still in the sink, a quilt thrown across the couch, boots by the door. It felt paused, like someone meant to return, but never did. Apollo padded in silently. His nose twitched. Then, without hesitation, he moved to the far bookshelf. He nosed a loose panel, and John, watching closely, stepped over and pulled. Behind it, a hidden compartment. Inside, a leather-bound journal. John opened the first page. March 12th. Charles thinks someone's watching the cabin. Apollo's been restless. He scratches the back door at night. I think he senses something we can't. April 7th. Daniel hasn't come back in days. We're worried. April 19th. We've packed a box with everything. If something happens, Apollo will remember. John sank onto the couch, the journal trembling in his hands. They had known. They had prepared. And somehow Apollo had carried it all. The grief, the warning, the memory. Without ever saying a word. He looked at the dog, who sat quietly at his feet. You've been trying to show us all along. Apollo thumped his tail once. Outside, the forest whispered, and somewhere beyond the trees, the last threads of truth were waiting to be pulled.
Chapter 9, The Letter. The journal ended abruptly. No final entry. Just a blank page, smudged in one corner as if someone had closed it too quickly, or too late. John placed it on the table, hands still. Apollo sat at the hearth, eyes fixed on the bookshelf. Then he stood. Walked to the side cabinet. Scratched once. John rose and opened the drawer. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of faded postcards, was a thick envelope. Sealed. Heavy. Addressed in curling ink. To the one who finds Apollo. John hesitated, then broke the seal. Inside, a letter, 3 pages long, written in Edith's careful hand. If you're reading this, it means we didn't make it back. It means Apollo did. We never should have trusted Daniel again. We wanted to, we tried. But something changed in him. The money, the inheritance fight, it poisoned him. He said he wanted to help us, but we saw the signs. He started asking questions he shouldn't. Wanted access to Charles's old investments, the cabin deed, even the dog. When Charles refused to hand it over, the threat started, quiet at first, then louder. Accidents happen, he said. We made this box for Apollo. If something happened, we believed he'd find his way back. We didn't know to whom, only that he'd remember the ones we trusted. Maybe even you, John. Please, don't let Daniel cover the trail. Find the truth. We loved him once, but he's not the same man anymore. And Apollo, he's more than a pet. He's memory, and loyalty, and our last hope. John stared at the letter, unmoving. The fire popped behind him. The wind creaked through the rafters. Apollo stepped closer and rested his head against John's knee. Daniel wasn't missing. He was hiding. And maybe, watching. Back outside, as John locked the door behind him, the silence felt heavier. He glanced over his shoulder toward the tree line. Somewhere, not far from here, his brother might still be out there. Waiting. Chapter 10, A Warning Ignored. They returned from the cabin just before dusk. The house looked unchanged from the outside, quiet, warm, still. But the moment they stepped inside, John felt it. Something off. Not wrong, exactly, just touched. Margaret greeted them with a soft smile. You were gone a while. John didn't speak. He handed her the journal and the letter. As she read, her hands began to tremble. Apollo paced. Not in circles, not restless. He moved room to room, nose high, ears sharp. Then came the phone call. The landline rang just past 7 p.m. John picked it up, expecting a telemarketer. Silence. Then, a man's voice, calm, low, oddly polite. You've stirred up ghosts, John. A pause. Leave the past where it belongs. Click. John stood frozen, the dial tone buzzing against his ear. Margaret's eyes searched his. What is it? He repeated the words slowly. Apollo growled from the front hallway. His body stiffened, tail low, gaze fixed on the window. Outside, across the street, under the glow of a flickering lamp post, a man stood watching. Long coat. Hat pulled low. Gone in seconds. John double-locked the doors that night. Moved the box to the upstairs bedroom. Placed a heavy flashlight on the nightstand. Apollo didn't sleep. He sat at the foot of the stairs, silent and still. A sentinel. Some ghosts don't stay buried. Some wear shoes. And coats. And wait for you to get too close to remembering. Chapter 11, The Man in the Park. The next morning came dim and restless. A mist hung over the park like a held breath. John took Apollo for a walk, hand clenched around a leash even though Apollo never pulled. They circled the familiar oak tree, its roots swollen with rain and memory. Then John saw him. The man. Same long coat. Same slow pace. Standing by the bench near the edge of the path, pretending to read a newspaper that didn't move in the breeze. Apollo stopped cold. Hackles raised. A growl, low, guttural, rumbled through his chest. The man looked up. Brief eye contact. Then he turned and walked away. Fast. Too fast. John hesitated, but instinct overruled fear. He followed. Apollo tugged forward without command. Through the park paths, past the playground, under the bridge. The man stayed just ahead, deliberate, like he wanted to be followed but not caught. Then he disappeared. At the edge of a parking lot, he was simply gone. No cars started. No footsteps. Just silence. John stood there, panting, heart racing. Apollo sniffed the air, nose high. And then he barked, loud, sharp, once, and stopped. He had their scent now. Back home, John searched public records again. Daniel Holloway. No death certificate. No declared residence. But a name had popped up twice in recent years, as a co-signer on 2 land transfers near Woodvale. Alias, D. Harris. Harris was their mother's maiden name. And both signatures had one witness in common, Charles Bell. John leaned back in the chair, a slow dread creeping into his spine. Apollo lay at the threshold, gaze fixed on the front door. They both knew. The past wasn't just alive. It was watching. Chapter 12, The Break-In. It happened just after midnight. A thud, quiet, but wrong. Then the sharp crack of wood splintering near the back door. John shot up in bed. Apollo was already gone. Downstairs, shadows moved. John grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand, heart pounding, breath shallow. He crept toward the stairs, every board underfoot sounding like thunder in the dark. Then, a growl. Deep. Primal. Unmistakable. Apollo. Followed by a sharp yelp, not his. When John reached the kitchen, the back door was hanging open. Wood shattered. Glass on the floor. And in the center of it all, Apollo, standing over a man doubled on the ground, clutching his bleeding arm. The box lay nearby, thrown from its shelf, its lid cracked open. John's flashlight caught the intruder's face for a second, pale, bearded, unfamiliar. But his eyes. Sharp. Calculating. Not random. This wasn't a burglar. He was looking for something specific. And he'd gone for the box. The man scrambled up and bolted through the broken door, vanishing into the night before John could stop him. Apollo didn't chase. He returned to the box, nudged it gently with his nose, and lay beside it, guarding, trembling slightly, but unhurt. John knelt, breathless, and whispered, "You saved us." Apollo pressed his head into John's chest. And for the first time since arriving, he closed his eyes. The police found nothing. No fingerprints. No ID. Just a broken lock, a blood smear on the floor, and a dog with eyes that dared them to try anything foolish. That night, John moved the box to the attic. But he knew it wasn't over. Whoever wanted it wasn't finished. Chapter 13, The Confrontation. John didn't sleep. He sat in the attic beside the box, a bat across his knees, Apollo curled protectively at his side. Morning came gray and slow, the kind of day that didn't deserve color. He made a decision. By noon, John was back on the road, this time alone. Margaret had wanted to come. He told her no. "If I don't come back by nightfall, call Sheriff Bellman. Tell him everything." Apollo stayed behind, reluctantly. John needed to do this as a man, not as a shadow guarded by a loyal dog. He followed the trail of property records, credit aliases, and ghost names. It led to a rundown trailer on the outskirts of Woodvale. Surrounded by overgrowth. No mailbox. One truck with a tarp over it. And smoke curling from the chimney. He knocked. No answer. Then, "Go away." The voice stopped his heart. Low. Gravel-lined. A voice he hadn't heard in nearly 30 years. "Daniel?" A pause. The door creaked open. His brother stood there, older, thinner, eyes hollow but sharp. "You should have stayed gone," Daniel said. Inside, the place smelled of metal and damp earth. Walls cluttered with maps, documents, and receipts. A table covered in open files, one with Charles and Edith's photo paper clipped at the top. "What is this?" John asked. "You already know. You threatened them." Daniel scoffed. "They were sitting on everything. Stocks. Bonds. Real estate. They left it in some trust one couldn't touch unless they both died. So yeah, I pressured them. Didn't mean to kill them." John stared. "But you did." Daniel's jaw tightened. "They weren't supposed to be on the plane that day." "They were. I didn't crash it." Daniel slammed his fist on the table. "I just made sure the mechanic didn't see the worn fuel line. It was a nudge, not murder. John's fists curled. And what about Apollo? Daniel sneered. Stupid dog's been chasing ghosts for 2 years. I figured he'd end up dead in the woods. Didn't think he'd come back with a scrapbook. John stepped closer. You tried to erase them. And now you're afraid a dog will undo it all. Daniel didn't respond. So John leaned in and said it. He's already undone it. He left with the box of documents under his arm, proof. Names. Signatures. A timeline of manipulation. He didn't look back. Daniel never followed. Back home, Apollo met him at the porch. No bark. Just a long, still stare. John knelt and whispered, "It's done." Apollo exhaled, pressed his head into John's chest, and for the first time since he'd arrived, wagged his tail. Chapter 14, The Resting Place. It was just past twilight when they gathered beneath the old oak. The air was soft, the kind that carried the scent of rain even when skies were clear. A hush blanketed the park, not empty, just reverent. John knelt by the roots, his hands dirty from digging. Beside him, Margaret held a small wooden box, the box, now gently sealed with a new brass clasp. Inside it were no longer secrets, but memories. Photos. Letters. The scarf. A flash drive containing the documents that had buried Daniel's lies. And 2 small urns. One marked Charles. The other Edith. Apollo stood watch as they placed the box into the earth. He didn't move, didn't flinch, but his breathing was deeper now. Slower. His eyes reflected the fire of the setting sun, but they weren't searching anymore. John covered the hole with care. Smoothed the soil. Then placed a stone atop it, flat, round, and carved with the simplest of words. Love endures. Margaret rested her head on John's shoulder. Do you think they know? I think they always did, John said. That's why they chose him. They stood in silence, and then Apollo stepped forward. He sat before the stone. Lowered his head. And stayed like that, still as memory, quiet as grief, for a long, aching moment. Then, finally, he stood. Turned to John. And wagged his tail. Some guardians protect more than lives. Some guard love itself, until it finds its resting place. Chapter 15, The New Treasures. The house felt different now. Not louder. Not brighter. Just, lighter. Like something had been lifted from its beams, from its bones. Apollo no longer slept beside the attic door. He no longer curled around the sealed box. He now slept where he wanted, the foot of Margaret's armchair, the middle of the hallway, the sunny patch by the dining room window. And sometimes, beside John's bed. Not as a sentinel. But as family. In the living room, Margaret had placed a new basket on the rug. Inside, a red ball, a plush fox, a pair of slippers no longer guarded. And in the center, a small, velvet pouch. Not locked. Not hidden. Inside it were their new treasures, as she called them. A photo of the 3 of them under the oak tree. A note John had written on the morning they adopted Apollo for good. And a silver tag engraved with his name. Apollo. You remembered for them. Now live for us. Sometimes he would rest his head on the edge of the basket and sigh, the kind of sigh dogs make when the world feels safe again. Other times, he would carry the pouch gently in his mouth and lay it at John's feet, tail wagging as if to say, "This is mine now. These are the ones I keep." Evenings were the softest. Margaret would read. John would nod off in his chair. And Apollo would sit at the window, watching the oak tree sway in the dark, its roots cradling stories that no longer needed guarding. Because some treasures are meant to be buried. And some, the ones made of trust, and healing, and shared silence, are meant to be carried forward. Chapter 16, Final Note. Some stories aren't shouted. They're whispered. Carried in fur and footstep. In quiet loyalty and long walks back to places forgotten. Apollo's story was never about heroism. It was about remembering. About waiting without resentment. Guarding without expectation. Loving past loss. He never asked to be the keeper of a box. He never chose to carry the weight of lives that vanished in fire and sky. But he did. Because love, real love, does not ask why. It just stays. When he curled beside John on the porch now, his eyes no longer searched. They settled. Soft. At peace. And when Margaret called his name in the garden, he came running, not because he was called, but because he belonged. Because the home he had once lost had found him again. Not in the same shape. Not in the same hands. But in the same warmth. The box remained buried beneath the oak. But the treasures he carried now were different. Not things. Moments. A laugh in the kitchen. A walk at dusk. A nap with sunlight warming his fur. And if one were to pass by that park someday, they might see him. A golden retriever, older now, sitting beneath a tree that cradled memory. Not waiting. Just remembering. Because some treasures aren't meant to be held. They are meant to be lived.